أهلا بكم. كشف أحدث مسح شهري أجرته رويترز لآراء مديري الأصول أن مديري صناديق الشرق الأوسط قد يزيدون تحركهم تجاه السيولة مع تنامي المخاطر الاقتصادية والجيوسياسية في المنطقة. المسح الذي أجري في الأيام العشرة الأخيرة من مارس شمل 15 شركة رائدة من شركات الصناديق في المنطقة. للمزيد ينضم إلي في الاستوديو السيد شهزاد جناب مدير إدارة الأصول في شركة ضمان للاستثمار. سيد جناب أهلا وسهلا بك. أنتم تديرون صندوق ضمان 5 الذي حقق الأداء الأفضل العام الماضي على مستوى الصناديق في العالم. أريد منك اليوم رؤيتك للعوامل التي تتحكم أو تساعد مدراء الصناديق اليوم في وضع استراتيجيتهم في المرحلة المقبلة تجاه بداية أسواق الأسهم في المنطقة.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Well, as you correctly pointed out, we were the top performing fund last year, globally as ranked by Preqin. And the performance for our fund, which is the Daman Fifth Fund, which is a GCC-wide performance, was 232%. And we ranked over the past 3 years the number 2 best performing fund in the world with a compound annual growth rate of about 72%. In terms of our market strategy going forwards and the outlook, firstly, as you pointed out, for the stock market, you know, we remain optimistic in terms of the stock market performance. I think if you take a look at from a valuation perspective, the Dubai financial market, we continue to run a big overweight within the Dubai financial market, and we also run an overweight in Saudi Arabia. Certainly, it is amongst the cheapest markets in the world. So whether you look at prospective earnings or you look at the Dubai market from a trailing earnings perspective, we're trading on about 8 times earnings with a prospective dividend yield of about 6%. And I can tell you, in a world which is very flush with liquidity and looking for cheap price stocks, we are amongst the cheapest in the world. Now, certainly we have to be cognizant of factors which are going to play an impact in terms of market psychology. So from a macro perspective, we think the UAE stands very, very strong. Whether you look at in terms of our GDP growth, you look at from a credit cycle perspective, our loans to deposit ratios, our banks are full with liquidity. We're running at about 18–90% loans to deposit ratios, abundant capital. And if you take a look at the loan growth cycle, you know, we're still only at about 8 to 9%. So that all bodes well in terms of the future.
إذا أدخلنا عنصر النفط إلى المعادلة، أين تصبح الأسواق الأكثر جاذبية إذا ما نظرنا إلى المنطقة؟ أسواق الدول المصدرة مقابل أسواق الدول المستوردة للنفط.
Yes, as you're quite right, oil is obviously playing a big impact at the moment, certainly in the market psychology. It's interesting I think a lot of the commentary that we see nowadays is people tend to focus a lot about it, but we need to take a look at oil and the correlation between our markets in a historical perspective. If we look at the correlations between whether we take Brent as a benchmark or WTI, the correlation between oil and let's take the GCC market as a whole, or if you take the UAE market, the correlation in the first half of last year between oil and our market was 0.2. Second half, the correlation went to 0.9. So this is in particular after the OPEC meeting in November. So that meant that oil became very important. Interestingly enough, we ran at around about 0.9 in January, but in February, the correlation's reversed. This is when oil prices stabilized, as you may recall. And in fact, if you take the first quarter, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, where the market tends to be, obviously there's a lot of petrochemical giants like SABIC listed, and the market cap of petrochemical tends to be higher, the rest of the GCC markets do not exhibit that much of a correlation at the moment as we speak with oil. Now, we talked about oil importers versus oil exporters. Well, clearly, as a thematic, if you take, this is a theme that is playing out globally right now, where net oil importing countries are getting a massive windfall gain as a result of the more than halving in oil prices. From a regional perspective, a clear beneficiary of that is Egypt, so actually if you take a look at the correlation of oil prices between Egypt and the oil price is actually an inverse correlation. So clearly they're a big beneficiary of obviously the halving in oil prices.
أخيرا كيف تختلف مصادر السيولة لأسواق الدخل الثابت في مقابل أسواق الأسهم في المنطقة، وبالتالي ماذا يمكن لنا أن نتوقع عن مستويات هذه السيولة؟
Very good question. Well, first of all, let's start with stock markets. Our stock markets in the region in general are dominated by retail investors. Institutional element tends to be at best between 20 to 30%. Obviously, an important dynamic is the foreign institutions, which started becoming prevalent post the MSCI emerging markets upgrade that we saw last year. Now, this is in stark contrast to obviously what we see in the fixed income market. In the fixed income market, the participants are predominantly institutional investors, and banks tend to be a big part of that. Foreign institutions tend to be a big part of that, and the retail element is relatively small by comparison. So you tend to get more stability, and if you witness the recent surges, for example, in Sukuks and fixed income issuances that we're seeing, and in fact, I was reading a report today that Saudi is about to issue their first sovereign debt in 8 years with a greater than maturity of, for example, 12 months. And this is important because it means that you don't get the same level of volatility in the fixed income and Sukuk market that we tend to get, obviously, in the retail market. Now, for me as a professional fund manager, you know, there's a very old saying in the markets that volatility is your friend as long as you're on the right side of the vol curve, which means that professional money managers can make money in volatile markets as long as they're on the right trade. So, you know, it's the real professional money managers that have been exhibiting strong alpha and good returns. You know, I think that the forthcoming period should be a good one for them, because a lot of people, you know, a rising tide lifts all boats. You know, but in an environment where you truly have to differentiate and search for good investment opportunities, I think professional money managers can look, you know, with starry-eyed to the future coming, because I think this will be a good forthcoming period for them.
السيد شهزاد جناب مدير إدارة الأصول في شركة ضمان للاستثمار، شكرا جزيلا.